Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to be welcoming you to the energy panel of this year's Latin American Investment Forum. I'm honored to be chairing this panel, but mainly because it's a fascinating topic and we've got experts from around the region to discuss it, but also because it's a final session before lunch. And one thing I've learned doing these conferences is that the session before the free food is always well attended. So without any further ado, I'm going to give each member of the panel 2 minutes to discuss themselves, to explain their expertise. Then we'll crack on with the questions. So it will be about half an hour of me interrogating them, and then we'll open up the questions to you. So perhaps if we start with Amauris at the far end, and we'll bring it in.
Thank you, James, and thank you, everyone. Good morning. My name is Amauris Vásquez, and I am a partner of the law firm De Camps, Vásquez and Valera. I would like to share with you today my experience in the development of energy projects in the Dominican Republic, both conventional and renewable. And I would like to stress the political risk that we have in our country and the challenges that we face in the regulatory framework, and help you with any concerns or inquiries you might have.
I am Antonio Celia. Thank you for the invitation, first of all. My name is Antonio Celia. I was an engineer. I retired from Promigas in August this year. Promigas is a main player in the energy sector in Latin America, a company that was founded in 1963, when no one was talking about natural gas in Colombia. Promigas was founded, and it became an important holding of energy companies, with 18 companies as part of their portfolio, from being a regional pipeline in the Atlantic coast of the Colombian Caribbean. More important than that, I think, is that Promigas pioneered the development of natural gas in Colombia, which has been one of the most important successes of natural gas history in the world. And that was made within the last 25 years. As a matter of fact, 64% of people in Colombia have natural gas, the residences. And Promigas is present not only in Colombia, but as well in Peru. And two final clarifications. I'm not a doctor. In Colombia, many people are the doctor. I'm not a doctor. And I am now. I was retired for this sector, but natural gas is so good that you never retire from natural gas. And now I'm a visiting professor in practice in the London School of Economics. And it's an honor for me being here and being a visiting professor in practice at the London School of Economics. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. My name is Neil Perry. I'm the CFO of Solar Century. Solar Century is a solar photovoltaic company, and we're based here in London, covering Europe, Africa, and also Latin America. Photovoltaics, for those who don't know, is turning light into electricity. That's the type of solar we do. We have two businesses. We've got a residential solar business. If you go into an IKEA store in the UK, Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, buy a solar system, you'll come through Solar Century. The bigger part of our business is a project business, mainly large-scale, utility-scale solar projects. We are a developer, constructor, operator, manager, and owner of large-scale utility solar projects around the world. We have around 3 gigawatts of projects in our current pipeline. To give you some idea of money, what that means money-wise, we're about to come to financial close on 2 projects in Spain, totaling around 500 megawatts. That's going to be a project financing, a total project finance of around 320 million euros, to give you some idea of scale. In Latin America, we have offices in Mexico, Panama, and Chile. And we cover the region from those 3 countries. Now, the title of this session is How to Keep the Lights On. The answer is simple. I'll come to it in a second. The cost of solar power has come down. It's 1/10 of the price it was 10, 12 years ago. And the costs keep coming down. And that is best shown in the example of Mexico in the region we're covering today. The recent renewable energy auctions in Mexico have led to, in the last auction, prices of just over $20 a megawatt. The wholesale price of conventional electricity in Mexico is about 3 times that. So there are no subsidies involved in this. That's true in other countries. You just heard about Chile. The same thing's true there. Prices down in the low 20s in terms of dollars per megawatt hour. So there are no taxpayer dollars involved in this. So if you want to reduce your cost of electricity in Latin America and you don't want to send a bill to the taxpayer, you need to invest in renewables.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Vanesa Bandak. I'm the investment manager of PROESA. It's the Export and Investment Promotion Agency of El Salvador. One of the sectors that we promote a lot is the energy sector. That is one of the sectors that is increasing a lot in attracting foreign investment. El Salvador is the smallest country in Central America. I don't know if you have been there or you know about it, but it's improving a lot in the facilitating of doing business. Right now, we have classified as one of the 10 economies in the world, worldwide, as improving the climate for attracting investment. Right now, we are the 2nd in Central America and the number 6 in Latin America. And we have a dollarized economy, so we don't have the risk of exchange that normally most of Latin American countries have. And we manage one of the lowest inflation rates that Latin American countries also have. We have a lot of incentives to attract investment. For this sector, we have a legal framework that gives incentives to companies that wants to invest in El Salvador, including other sectors too, such as productivity sector, tourism sector, etc. And the other thing is that we have improved a lot in the infrastructure. We have a lot to attract, to make public-private partnership projects. And we are right now evaluating several projects that will help the country in order to build different infrastructures that we need, such as ports, such as airports. And we are trying to attract investment to build and evaluate and administrate those projects for the government. So it's a pleasure to be here this morning.
Excellent, thank you. Well, now we know who all the panelists are, let's crack on with the questions. So one of the interesting things that you can do is if you look at the share of different energy sources and power generating sources in Latin America and then compare that to the world. So if you do that, you see, for example, Latin America is very overweight in hydropower. It gets more than half of its electricity generated from hydropower. Which most people would probably say is a good thing. It's very, very underweight coal, just 5% in coal compared to about 41% around the rest of the world. And it's overweight in oil. Natural gas, renewables are more or less in line with the average, but they're the standout figures: overweight hydro, overweight oil, underweight coal. So just to start this, I'm going to ask Amauris first. Most Latin American countries want nothing to do with coal power plants, especially nowadays renewable is in vogue. For some reason, I'm not sure why, the Dominican Republic has just committed to a huge coal-fired power plant. Amauris, why is the Dominican Republic doing that?
Thank you, James. First of all, I would like to say that I can't speak for the Dominican government. In fact, I am an opposition party, so. But I'll try to be fair because this is logical. So, first, I would like to give you a brief introduction of the Dominican electricity sector. The Dominican electricity sector runs with a deficit. This has been historically, and it's caused because the distribution companies doesn't have the monies to pay the generators. And that's caused because of 3 main reasons. First, the government has not been able to put in force the technical tariff set for by the electricity law. And that's because there's a huge social component which will be transferred to the people paying the electricity. Second, the technical losses in the distribution lines and the transmission lines. And third, which is the most important, is the theft. People don't like to pay electricity in Dominican Republic. So there's a huge disadvantage in comparison to other countries.
Amauris, am I right in thinking it's about 30%?
Yes.
Whereas in other developing, because theft is a factor across developing markets, theft of electricity, but normally maybe 10 or 15% in Latin America. But in the Dominican Republic, it's really, really high, isn't it? 30%?
It's really high. It's almost 30%, and the technical loss is 10. So you can add it. From 10 units that you produce, you only deliver 60, and from that 70, sorry, and from that you just collect 60%.
And presumably the government doesn't go after the theft more aggressively because it's worried about the political costs, i.e. that's votes. If you go after these people, you lose votes.
That's correct, and that's the same as the technical tariff. The electricity should be higher, the cost, because we import all the oil and the LNG and now the coal that we use to produce the electricity. But going to your question, why the coal? The government gives two main reasons. First, they don't want to depend heavily on LNG, which is the basis of approximately 35% of the production of the electricity in the Dominican Republic. The renewables are approximately 20%, from which 15% is it's from hydropower. So that leaves just 5% for photovoltaic, wind, and biomass. The government explanation is that since we just have one facility to import the LNG, it's an AES terminal in Boca Chica, which imports the LNG for the major power plant in the Dominican Republic, which is a 300 megawatt LNG firepower, and some other units of AES. They don't want to depend that much in LNG. That's the excuse. And they claim that also when they were, this is not committing power plants. They are almost finished. They are now making the technical proofs, trying to start operations in early next year. Another reason that the government gives is that when they were planning to produce and construct these power plants, the LNG in the world sector was very difficult to contract. And since we were a little island with no access to LNG producers, they claim that they wasted like 5 years trying to approach and contract LNG with no luck. I don't necessarily agree with that.
You sound skeptical.
Yes, because in my professional, I have relationship with the oil traders, major oil traders, and that's not true.
So just to wrap this up, because I guess what I'm keen to learn from this is the Dominican Republic, in the case of coal, an outlier? So there's particular local situations that apply to the Dominican Republic, but we can't expect that in the rest of the region. So it sounds from what you're telling me that they're all very kind of specific Dominican Republic factors at work here.
Yes, and mainly because, as I told you, they don't want to depend just on LNG. The government believes that with the commissioning of these two power plants, the deficit in the sector is going to reduce a lot. And they believe that the prices of the coal are going to be sustainable in the future more than the LNG.
Excellent. Thank you, Amauris. And that you mentioned LNG, that's perfect, because that brings me on to the next question, which is natural gas. And there's two panelists here that may be particularly interested in answering this question. One is, of course, Antonio, former CEO of Promigas, and also Vanesa, who explained to me that El Salvador is about to build what will be Central America's second natural gas plant. So my question is this: if you actually look at the statistics, Latin America's use of natural gas is more or less on line with the world average. I think it's about 20%, something like that. 21. This is just for the power sector. It's in line with the world average. My question is, if you think that is going to change markedly over the next 10 or 20 years, will we see a big increase in Latin Americans' use either for power generation or for primary energy demand? And I will go first to Vanesa. If you explain, Vanesa, why El Salvador has turned to natural gas.
Okay, one of the policies that El Salvador is trying to improve is to diversify the matrix of energy. So we started to do a lot of tenders, international tenders, and one was for LNG, 355 megawatts. So that is, as you mentioned, will be the second plant of LNG in Central America beside Panama with AES, the investment of AES over there. So for 2021, we are gonna start generating energy with this resource, and will be representing the 13% of the energy that we will have in the matrix of El Salvador. This is part of the 6 tenders that we already have in El Salvador. Right now we have one tender of 28 megawatts. It's a small tender for photovoltaic and biomass. But the other ones was mostly for photovoltaic. And this is the biggest project that we have in the energy that came from El Salvador and it's an investment from United States. So they have right now doing a lot of process of permits and all the things that they have to do in the finance, how they are going to finance the project. They have investors from United States and from El Salvador too. So they are working together with the government. We're helping with them, trying to facilitate everything. So all the process of establishment of the project is working, and we hope in 2021 we'll have that plant already producing energy.
Thank you. And Antonio, as a doctor, no, I'm only joking. Antonio, you're
Professor. It's different. In practice.
So what do you think, Antonio? Will we see natural gas? Will we see its participation in Latin America climbing up dramatically?
They're doing the right thing. I think that we should see more LNG to power, especially given that the United States is going to have a huge amount of natural gas in the Gulf to be exported. And what we're expecting is very good prices. And then Panama already did. Salvador is doing the LNG project to power. I think that is the trend. Coal is not a good word for these days. I know you're in the position. We tried to build an LNG facility in Dominican Republic for 10 years. It was not possible because of the institutions and because of a past that should be recovered, in the sense that the base of the pyramid is not paying the electricity. So your problems begin there. In Colombia, we solved that situation 25 years ago. And I talked to many Dominican friends and Dominican agents of different governments and explained to them how we did it. We put some sincerity back in the 90s when we had an ambassador. As you remember, we have a huge blackout because of Fenómeno del Niño. People didn't pay the bills. And then we put some sincerity, which means let's establish a cross subsidy. Those who can pay a little bit more, and those who cannot pay will pay a little bit less. And it worked. Now we have to see another picture in the future in terms of how can we maintain those subsidies, which we shouldn't. But natural gas is the way to go, especially in Central American countries and the Caribbean. Now, the other important factor that we have to take into account is Venezuela. Venezuela has 30 or 40 times the reserve that natural gas Colombia has. Now, when that disaster is over, something has to happen, because, by the way, We already have a pipeline between Venezuela and Colombia with a 500 million capacity. It's not being used at all. So the picture of the energy map in that area will change. Having said that, I want to remark that we're going to have 5 or 6 exporters in the Gulf of Mexico offering natural gas at very good prices. As you said, that was a bad excuse in my opinion, because natural gas, as far as I'm concerned, was the best option for Dominican Republic. And today, trade of LNG is very important, is very reliable, so they shouldn't be afraid of depending on another plant of natural gas, which, by the way, Colombia is going to build another one. Not even Colombia, being by far the main coal producer in the area, is using coal for power production.
Excellent, thank you for that very emphatic answer. And I've got to come to Neil now, because I can see, judging by the look on his face, he's been brought on this panel as a solar producer, and he's listening to us talk about coal and gas.
Solar doesn't fight with natural gas. They're very good friends. They are complement. Isn't that, Neil?
He does not look happy. So Neil, I just want to jump in there. I would say, being simplistic, I would say there are 3 big factors in developing renewable energy. One is the natural conditions. So obviously solar is going to work a lot better in a sunny country than a cloudy country. One other is a regulatory landscape. And the other then are the financing conditions. If there's financial entities in that country that can invest those types of projects. I know you've got experience from Argentina to Mexico. I know that Solar Century is present across the region. Talk me through which are the most attractive countries in Latin America right now, considering those factors that I mentioned for solar energy.
Yeah, well, the solar resource across Latin America is very good. It's just all relative. I mean, the best areas are up in the Andean regions in northern Chile, Peru, and also in northern Mexico. I mean, that's the optimal places. And Colombia is also good, but those are the best places if you look at the map. But solar resource in Latin America is excellent. So there's absolutely no reason why you can't deploy it pretty much anywhere. And I would just say, going on from the last conversation, I mean, what one shouldn't forget is the combination of solar, wind, and storage is a very powerful combination. And yes, of course, there's a place for gas, but the cost of battery storage is coming down very rapidly, and that's something that governments shouldn't just ignore. So,
but sorry, just to interject there, because forgive my ignorance, I thought that large-scale utility battery application was still not ready to be competitive.
No, that's not true. We're building a completely off-grid system in Eritrea at the moment, and the levelized cost of power is massively lower than if you were to build a electricity grid out to those particular towns. So
for remote situations, and instead of building out the grid, it makes sense.
But we're now getting to the point. I mean, I'll give you an example of the UK. There's a business case building, and it probably will be relevant in the next 18 months, 2 years, where large-scale solar with storage in the UK is going to work.
So basically, if you're saying the combination of wind, solar, and storage, that would, I guess, contradict what Antonio is saying about the growing use of gas.
Well, I think what it says is that it's an alternative. I mean, I can understand why with shale gas in the US, why that's attractive. I mean, I'm not sure what the levelized cost of natural gas is with an LNG plant, Antonio, but is it lower than $20 a megawatt?
I'm talking about the commodity. Natural gas imports in Colombia from the Gulf of Mexico should range between 9 and 12 US per million BTU. In a combined cycle, I don't know exactly, but it's very competitive. Without any doubt, it's very competitive.
So the levelized cost less than $20 a megawatt of power, of electricity?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not an engineer anymore, remember?
He's a doctor.
Okay. I forgot those maths.
I think the numbers are pretty close. I know I'm not an expert on LNG.
That's ballpark. I think it's 2025, maybe 2030.
Yeah. But anyway, sorry, I didn't want to.
But you need the base of your generation. You need natural gas anyhow. I mean, in my opinion, the combination should be solar, some wind in the case of Colombia, and natural gas.
Yeah,
and hydro, because many countries in Latin America have hydros. Now, no more huge hydros. After what happened in Colombia with Rio Tango, I think that was a very expensive lesson.
Why? Because there's too many protests, environmental protests, social protests.
Durango, the huge, maybe the most important hydro power plant in Latin America in the last 25 years is failing. It's failing
Running out of
because
water.
some structural problems, and it's a huge issue. And it's a very complicated issue to solve, and that's going to change our matrix, and that's going to change our short and mid and long-term energy production. And what's going to happen is that we're going to expedite those auctions for non-traditional fuels.
So basically, hydro's share, large-scale hydro's share, will come down slightly.
I think no more large hydros, no more coal. That's my wishful thinking. That's my list. But again, I have arguments for my position. Natural gas, solar, the more you can. Hydros, what you already have, a micro hydro plants where you can have that opportunity. And wind in Colombia, in the north part of Colombia, and where you can take advantage of the geographic situation, but no more large hydros and no more coal. The world will do itself a favor canceling all coal plants.
Okay, excellent, thank you. And I just want to go back to Neil, because we sort of
should
got
answer your
derailed
question.
slightly. Yeah.
Right. The answer to your question is Mexico, Chile, and Colombia.
For the regulatory and financial.
Probably in that order, but Chile, Mexico, very close together. Clearly, or possibly the other way around. But the key thing about what these prices that I mentioned in the Mexican auction, obviously a key factor in getting to those low prices is the cost of capital, because as I gave you from my Spanish example, this is serious amounts of money, and it involves project finance, it involves equity investors. Therefore, the cost of capital is crucial. So the cost of capital is clearly lower in Chile and Mexico compared to Argentina, where Argentina has some fantastic solar resource, but the cost of capital is higher. So we're currently discussing a private PPA, not a government auction in Argentina, and we're talking somewhere in the mid-40s in terms of the price per megawatt hour. In terms of solar resource, there's absolutely no difference between good parts of northern Argentina, where our plants are, and other places in Mexico and Chile. But it's just the cost of capital. And obviously the regulatory regime is also important, because that factors into the cost of capital. So in Mexico, with the auctions, you've got a government offtake agreement, a 20-year PPA, and everything else is, by the way, is financed by the private sector. So not only is there no taxpayer dollars from Mexico going in to subsidize these plants, there's no investment either. All this money is coming from foreign investors. So the people building out these gigawatts of solar plants and wind plants in Mexico are from Italy, France, other parts of Europe, and the US, of course. So this is a win-win for governments across Latin America. But I would say at the moment those three are key. And obviously someone will ask, well, why not Brazil? Well, Brazil clearly has huge long-term potential. It's got the solar resource. There were issues in Brazil where there was a previous auction which the government ran for solar and wind PPAs, but unfortunately those auctions were run in reais. And at the time they were pretty attractive, but of course then the currency devalued and then those projects went underwater. There's a slightly bad taste in the mouths of certain investors. So it'll take time to recover in Brazil.
Excellent, thanks for that. I just want to ask now about oil, because as I mentioned earlier, Latin America is overweight in its use of oil, and you can see that in two ways. If you look at electricity generation, Latin America gets about 13% of its power generated from oil. And if you look at the primary energy demand, so taking into account cars and transport, Latin America is more dependent on oil than any other region on Earth apart from the Middle East. So Latin America structurally is built on oil. And as all of you, I'm sure, know Latin America very well, you know that when you're in the cities, when you're in Bogota, when you're in Santo Domingo, you get these horrible traffic jams, you smell the fumes. Costa Rica, I've just come back from Costa Rica. Everyone talks about how green Costa Rica is. Costa Rica has got an energy matrix, an energy power grid that runs on 99% green energy. but the traffic situation in Costa Rica and San Jose is not green whatsoever. So Latin America has to transition away from oil. I don't see that happening anytime soon because you don't see much movement with good public transport systems or with electric vehicles. I would like to ask the panel, and Amauris, I'd start with you.
Well, in Dominican Republic, we have a major issue, which is we don't produce any oil. So right now, the Ministry of Energy, it's putting up the legal framework for a public international bid for exploration of oil in the country. They have divided the country in 4 sectors, and the idea is to give concessions to international players for exploring the potential of producing oil in the Dominican Republic. The preliminary studies indicates that there's viable commercially resource of oil in the south part of the island. So that might help us to mitigate the issue with the oil. Another step that the country is taking is promoting the renewable energies, which I believe it's the future of the humanity, because it's clean and you don't have the disadvantages of oil and, let's not say, natural gas. For the renewables, we have a very strong framework. We have a general electricity law and a renewable energy law. We have photovoltaic projects, 2 large-scale utilities, 50 megawatts and 35 megawatts. There's another one being constructed at this time. It's from a Canadian company, 25 megawatts more. We also have the first large utility scale biomass plant in the region, which is a 35 megawatts biomass power plant from sugarcane. No, it's not ethanol, it's from the bagazo of the sugarcane. So it's an icon in the region. And also we have 135 megawatts of wind, mainly from 2 developers in the south part of the island, but we have a strong potential. For example, in solar, we have the double of the capacity of England, of UK, for example. Of course, we're in the tropics, that's a reality. And in the wind sector, for example, the current projects, they are onshore and they have produced plus than 45% of capacity. So we have a very solid resource of energy, of solar, wind, and biomass capability.
Thank you, Amauris. And just to come to Antonio now, because in Colombia, you have seen some positive movements. I believe there's a planned metro in Bogota, obviously the Transmilenio bus, which helps because it gets more people on public transport and hopefully out of their cars. Do you think, because obviously when we're talking about transitioning from oil, we're not just talking about building solar plants or wind farms, we're talking about the transport sector and getting people on to cleaner forms of transport. Do you think that's going to happen in Colombia?
That's Sir John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run, we all will be dead. But in the meantime, we better use natural gas. That's the problem in Latin America with depending on oil is basically mobility, okay? And it's a matter of culture, it's a matter of traditions, and it's a matter of our history. We all want to drive our cars. Public transportation in Latin America in general is not very appreciated and very important. Bogota, 8 million people, doesn't have a metro, but they're still discussing whether to build it or not. It will go ahead. So the dependent on oil in the case of Colombia is basically the big mobility. And we should aim to have clean, massive transportation systems. We already have 2. Medellin, Metrobus, and Transcaribe in Cartagena, they both use natural gas. I believe that in the future, most of the massive transportation system will run electric, many of them, but in the meantime, natural gas is an excellent option. We have in Colombia already 400,000 vehicles running with natural gas. It's a very good alternative. And using ethanol is also an alternative, although I understand this is a big discussion whether it's ethical to transform food into, and this is the whole discussion. But again, natural gas is a good option. But what we should do is go for massive transportation system, not using diesel, which is very expensive. The rest of it, the industry in Colombia, most of the industry uses natural gas. And again, most of our big cities in Latin America, where we're concentrated, 80% of people in Latin America live in big cities, and this is a phenomenon that's been occurring during 30 years. We need to improve our massive transportation system and try to tax utilization of private vehicles, which is not efficient and which is very contaminated.
Excellent. Thank you, Antonio. I'm getting frantic signals from the back to open this up for questions. So please, if there are any questions, please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. The gentleman there at the back, if someone could pass him a microphone.
Thanks. Hi there. Neil, a question for you. How do you see the prospects in the countries that you've operated so far in Latin America for, I guess you call them off-grid solar systems? Solar energy systems. You know, I imagine, for example, at the municipal level in some remote parts of, you know, northern Peru, how feasible is it that a local government could set up, you know, a municipal level solar-driven electricity system without having to go through all the regulations of the national regulator and all those sort of complications?
Yeah, the regulatory system in that example of northern Peru, I wouldn't be able to comment on. But what I can tell you is that, you know, just as we're building exactly that system you described, a mini grid in Eritrea, the economics are exactly the same in Latin America, because what they'll be using at the moment are diesel generators, and the most expensive way of generating electricity in the world is using diesel generators, particularly old ones. So solar is an absolute no-brainer compared to using what they're currently using. So in terms of it making economic sense, absolutely. And the other applications of what you'd class as off-grid solar, obviously mining is a big user of remote power sources, diesel generators. And as we've seen across Africa, and increasingly across Latin America, there's clearly a market, and there's been some deals already signed for solar to replace diesel generation for big mining companies. And that's a question of signing a bilateral PPA with the mining company. And a number of those have already happened. There's huge potential in Colombia for this. So, yeah, the solar in Latin America has really has lagged behind other areas of the world, and it's catching up. It's catching up right now in these big utility scale systems, the kind of, you know, hundreds of megawatt type systems that I refer to when I'm talking about these government auctions, particularly in Mexico and Chile. But the other market, you know, and these typically are smaller scale systems, so they could be 10, 20 megawatt systems, maybe a little bit more. These will follow on behind for sure, as the technology is more accepted. And of course, as I said earlier, the cost of batteries coming down is obviously extremely helpful for these systems. I mean, in Africa, we do a lot of work with customers for food plants, flower plantations, anyone with a high energy load, where we're combining solar and diesel. So we have diesel hybrid systems because obviously they need a base load, and they need to keep some of the diesel generators still running. So, but that still brings down the levelized cost of power significantly. And just one very quickly while I'm on, the point about electric or public transport. I mean, no one in this room in 30 years' time is going to be driving a car with an internal combustion engine. We all know that. You're not going to get a taxi with one, and you're not going to get a bus with one. So whilst, yes, even in the UK, only 4% of new car sales are electric, clearly what economies, not just in Latin America, have to do is to plan ahead and build the infrastructure to allow electric vehicles to be feasible, and clearly that is going to have to happen, and that requires quite a lot of money. But the cost of batteries coming down, the cost of solar. I mean, obviously, you drive your vehicle, you take it home, your solar's charged up your batteries while you've been out, and you charge your car up when you come home. So it makes a lot of sense. So that would be my answer to the previous question as well.
Thank you. So we've got time for some more questions from the floor. Any further questions? The gentleman there at the back, and please say your name and your company before your question.
Len Panit Visaggio. It's a follow-on corollary question to that. What do you see as the advent of smart grids? And a second part to that, which is, what changes are you seeing in your respective areas for feed-in tariffs to be legal?
On the last point, I mean, there are virtually no countries now with feed-in tariffs. I mean, the last government support system for solar in Europe and wind as well and biomass is in the Netherlands, but that's an exception. So basically, the feed-in tariff, this model where governments would pay a solar or wind producer an enhanced tariff which required a government subsidy to make the thing economic, that just doesn't exist anymore. I mean, we've gone from that to an era, as I described earlier, where solar and wind, onshore wind anyway, is basically subsidy-free without any cost to the taxpayer. In terms of smart grids, what that does is allow for consumers like us to use that technology to combine solar typically, but it could be possibly wind, but and other forms of renewables on a local distributed basis to use demand side management to as you say, it's a smart grid. So if you can control your loads and your source of power, and you're in control of it, and it's in your house and you're not buying it from utility, then it's extremely powerful. And that will.
I would just like to bring in the rest of the panel as well, because I'd be quite intrigued. When we think about smart grids, we're thinking about technology and investment, and I'm quite intrigued to know how feasible or in what time frame is that possible and economically viable in smaller, maybe poorer economies like El Salvador or the Dominican Republic. So Amauris and then Vanesa, if you could share that.
Thank you, James. Answering your question, Dominican Republic has a special regime of tariffs for renewables. It's set forth by the ruling of application of the renewable law, but right now it's not being applied. Right now, what the government is doing, it's giving a special tariff for renewables higher than for conventional, but the problem is that we adopted the Spanish regime, which we all know had financial difficulties. So the government tried to adapt that regime and lower the price of the electricity, for example, for renewables. For example, the wind and solar projects that the government has approved recently, they have a tariff of 12 cents per megawatt. So that's the reality regarding the tariffs. Regarding the smart grids, there's a specialized unit at the energy company of the Dominican state, which is the CDEEE. That unit specializes in providing smart grid solutions to poor communities, and they focus on mini hydros, 8 to 10 megawatts maximum, and solar smart grids with photovoltaic and a closed grid for those communities. They work with public funds and funds from donations around the world, and it has improved the quality of many poor communities.
Thank you, Amauris. And Vanesa, is there much happening in El Salvador with smart grids or solar? Much government support?
Yeah, as I mentioned, El Salvador has a regulatory framework that gives incentives to this kind of investments. Right now, there's a lot of companies that has invest in solar panels in order to minimize the cost of energy, and they can sell the energy that they are produced to the government too. And for the other communities, there are some cases of projects that are going on with international cooperation in order to give access to energy to the communities that need it. So yes, these kind of projects are going on. Right now we have from the Millennium Challenge Corporation from the United States. El Salvador has received a lot of funds from them, and we are improving a lot of infrastructure of El Salvador, including this in order to get these services to the communities most needed.
Excellent, thank you, Vanessa. I've been told there's no more time for questions, but don't worry, you'll be able to go up and harangue them during the queue for lunch, so they're there to answer your questions. And I don't really think I'm going to try and attempt to sum this up. I think Antonio is perhaps a fan of natural gas. That's the impression that I've gleaned. And I think Neil is quite fond of solar energy. But please speak to them during the lunch break, because that's what this is all about. And thank you for your time.